My name is Gil McGowan. I'm president of the Alberta Federation of Labour. For those of you who are not familiar with the Federation, we're the umbrella organization for most unions in the province, representing 29 unions in the public and private sector, who in turn represent about 165,000 working Albertans. And these issues, the issues that we've been discussing, are always one of our top priorities as a labour movement. But for our purposes tonight, I want to start with a word that is more often heard in business circles or in business schools than in meetings like this. But I think it's a word that we should be talking about because it has huge implications for the way our government approaches workplace health and safety in general, and specifically it has huge implications for the way our Workers' Compensation Board deals with injured workers. And the word that I'm talking about is the word incentives. Economists will tell you that it's important to get the incentives right when it comes to developing workplace policy or public policy, and that if you get the incentives right, good things can happen. The flip side is that if you get the incentives wrong, very bad things can happen. And I would argue that one of the reasons, and there are many reasons, but one of the big reasons that we're having so many problems with our Workers' Compensation Board here in Alberta, and why other provinces are having similar problems, is because we fundamentally got the incentives wrong. We've allowed MBAs, business school graduates, to take some theories from the classroom and apply them to a system that should be there for working people, and these principles have gone horribly wrong. And let me explain in detail what I mean. One of the biggest problems that we face right now is with what we call experience rating systems. These are the systems that are used by the WCB to determine the premiums that are paid by employers that are using the system. And the way it works, right, most people in the audience know this, but I'll just sort of walk through, explain why it's a problem and what needs to be done about it. But in order to set premiums, what happens is that the Workers' Compensation Board will look at the injury experience of a particular workplace, and the lower the injury experience, the fewer claims, the lower their premiums would be. And in the classroom, in the business school classroom, this sounds great. You know, they say, well, we want to improve safety, and what better measure of improved safety could there possibly be than lower claims experience? And so on first blush, this sounds like it makes all sorts of sense, but as many of us know, it has resulted in perverse consequences, because what's happened, and what we in the labor movement and what groups like the injured workers groups have been saying for years, is that there are actually two ways you can get to lower claims experience. You could do what I think most people would hope employers would do, which is actually to improve workplace safety, which would thereby have the beneficial result of reducing claims, or you could just find some way to sweep the claims under the carpet, which is in fact what has been happening with employers across the province and in all sectors. Unfortunately, our experience with claims suppression, and that's the phrase that we in the labor movement and others use to describe what's been happening, our experience with claims suppression has been largely anecdotal. We hear stories you know, from our friends, from our coworkers, and we know in our guts that this is happening. But the government and the Workers' Compensation Board has been able to sort of shrug it off by saying, oh, if it's happening, it's just an isolated case, and it's not really representative of what all these wonderful employers in the province actually do. So that's one of the, but we know that it is true. We know that it is happening, and that's one of the results of the perverse results of bad incentives. We end up with employers that are trying to save money, get those lower claims, not by improving real workplace safety, but by actually suppressing claims, discouraging workers from filing claims in order to get that lower premium. Another related issue related to incentives has to do with what's happening within the WCB itself. Because the first, when it comes to experience rating, we're talking about behavior of employers, right? But there's also a problem inside the WCB itself, and I think Brian had alluded to this in his comments. But the Workers' Compensation Board has taken a similarly wrong-headed approach to incentives when dealing with their own claims managers, right? So they've gone to the claims managers and said that our goal is to reduce the number of claims, and they assume that claims reduction will lead to safety. But once again, what we see is a system here in Alberta, and this is unique in the country actually, where the Workers' Compensation Board actually provides monetary incentives to claims officers for essentially closing files quickly. They don't do it on an officer by officer basis. Instead, what they do is they set quotas for claims reduction. And if the corporation, and I think it's significant that the WCB refers to itself internally and externally as a corporation rather than an organization that's there to serve workers, but if the corporation meets its quotas in terms of closing files and reducing claims, then the claims officers actually automatically get bonuses that could be as much as $5,000 or $6,000 a year. So this is not insignificant, and it gives, in the same way that the employers have a huge financial incentive to suppress claims, sweep them under the carpet, because in return they get lower premiums. The case managers have a huge financial incentive to close files when they probably shouldn't be closed because they get this $5,000 or $6,000 bonus every year. Another incentive, which is outside of the WCB, but which is playing itself out across the province, especially in the construction sector, within firms, has to do with safety bonuses. And this is another area where we have lots of anecdotal evidence to suggest that things are going wrong, but we don't have a lot of specific proof. But what we know is that many construction firms, both union and non-union, are offering very substantial bonuses to their employees if they meet certain thresholds in terms of a number of hours worked without injury. And I can tell you that we've had people coming into our office at the Federation of Labour with some pretty grievous injuries. I've seen Boilermakers with horrible burns. I've seen iron workers with broken bones. And you ask them, so what happened? Did you go to the hospital? Did you file a claim? And in an uncomfortable number of cases, we hear, no, we didn't file a claim. I didn't want to, because it would have meant that we wouldn't have met our target in order to get a bonus. And because these bonuses are paid across a workforce, a lot of these guys feel pressure not only because they want the monetary reward of reaching the goal, but they also feel a certain amount of peer pressure, because if their injury is the one that stops their crew from meeting its target, then not only do they forfeit the monetary bonus, but so does everyone else on their crew. Okay, so so when I say that this word incentives is incredibly important for the conversation that we're having about the way the WCB works, you can see where it's coming from. But I want to end, and this has all been very dark and dismal, but I want to actually end on a hopeful note. And this is there's a story, a relatively recent story coming out of Manitoba, which I want to share with you, which provides hope and also a way forward for those of us who want to make change with the Workers' Compensation Board and with workplace health and safety more broadly speaking. And it has to do with work that's been done by the injured workers community in Manitoba, the labor movement, and also the provincial government. And what's happened over the last 5 or 6 years in Manitoba is that these voices from the labor movement and the injured workers community about concerns about claims suppression have actually sparked a review by the provincial government, which is in the process of leading to some very significant changes. And very specifically, the Manitoba Federation of Labour, about 2 or 3 years ago, challenged the provincial government, which not coincidentally is a New Democrat government and much more open to listening to these concerns. The Federation of Labour challenged the Manitoba government to actually investigate the labour movement's concerns about claims suppression. And after a couple of years of lobbying and pushing, the Manitoba government agreed that they would commission a study, which was released only about 2 months ago. And it's a landmark study that was conducted by a health and safety specialist from Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. So they brought in an outside expert to talk to employers in Manitoba and to gather empirical evidence to answer this question of whether or not the system was actually being gamed. And what the researcher discovered is basically what we've been saying all along. They actually found significant evidence that employers were responding to these incentives in ways that were not intended, and that in fact they were winning lower premiums, not by improving workplace safety, but by sweeping legitimate claims under the carpet. And so the researcher talked to literally hundreds of injured workers, and interestingly, and I think significantly, he actually also talked to a lot of employers who admitted that they were engaged in this practice. So, so we actually, for the first time in Canadian history, we actually have a study that demonstrates empirically that claims suppression is the result of poorly designed experience rating systems. And now that the study came down in I think it was the end of January, now just this week, actually, the Manitoba government came out with a report accepting all the findings of the study and agreeing to work towards implementation of the study's recommendations. And so we haven't seen the end result yet, but the Manitoba government has gone to the Manitoba Workers' Compensation Board, and they haven't said get rid of experience rating, but what they've said is, what can we do instead of experience rating? So they've challenged the WCB to go back to the drawing board and invent a new system for setting rates that will actually result in the desired outcomes, which are improved safety as opposed to just lower premiums. And so it's yet to be seen how this is going to play out. But for me, and for many of us in the labor movement who are concerned about these issues, this is an incredible step forward, not only because of the objective outcomes for workers in Manitoba, but because it gives us a legislative target to shoot for. Like once you have one government that actually starts taking these issues seriously, and you have a study in hand that actually substantiates a lot of the stuff that we've been complaining about for years, that makes our job in terms of lobbying governments much easier, even in a conservative province like Alberta. So this is all early days, but I'm very hopeful. This gives us a new avenue for pursuing an old issue. And so I'm just going to conclude by going back to the challenge. Like, I'm very hopeful about what's happened in Manitoba. I'm hopeful about the doors that it's opened, but I'm also mindful of the challenge that confronts us here in Alberta. Because in many ways it's the same challenge that's being faced by injured workers and the labor movement in other provinces, but in some ways it's a little bit more difficult here because, you know, injured workers are not just dealing with dangerous workplaces. I think we have to understand that we're actually dealing with a dangerous worldview coming down from our policymakers and political decision makers. And it's that worldview that has created many of the problems. And when I say worldview, I'm talking about a conception of government. Okay? And here in Alberta, one of the reasons that we're facing the problems that we have in terms of workplace health and safety is because we have a government in the Redford government, but also in all of their conservative predecessors, who look at the role of government differently than us. We look at the role of government we think the government should be there to defend and promote the public interest. And in the case of workplace health and safety, that means that we think government, and I think most Albertans and most Canadians would agree with this conception, that government should be there to make sure that workplaces are safe, that people get home safely at the end of the day, and that employers that knowingly put their workers at risk should be punished. That's our worldview, and I think there's a broadly held one in the public. But with government, we've got a government that looks at their role differently. They see their role as facilitators of success for business. And they think that anything that is an impediment to profit is something that should be swept away. And unfortunately, they've lumped workplace health and safety regulations and workplace health and safety protections in this category of things that make it harder for business to be successful. I think a lot of us would agree that's a faulty assumption. I would actually argue that safe workplaces improve the ability for companies to be profitable, but that's unfortunately, that nuance is sort of lost on a lot of our policymakers. And so the result is that we've got a government that just in a sort of knee-jerk fashion doesn't believe in regulation, doesn't believe in enforcement. And so what this worldview has brought us is a corporatized WCB that puts a priority on low premiums as opposed to actually improving workplace health and safety. But it's also a government that's given us a health and safety regime that we have the lowest prosecution rate for employers who have been found guilty of putting their workers at risk. I mean, just as an example, in an average year, our provincial government will prosecute maybe 12 employers for occupational health and safety violations. That compares to about 75 or 80 in BC and literally hundreds in Ontario. There's no other province that prosecutes employers at a lower rate than Alberta. We also have the dubious distinction of having the lowest number of workplace health and safety inspectors per worker in the whole country, even though we have many more people working in dangerous occupations. Like Alberta, for example, has double the number of people working in construction than any other province. So given the reality of our labor market, you'd think that we'd have more inspectors rather than less, but we don't. And we also have fewer tools for our inspectors to do their jobs well. And this is all a result of the way that our government looks at the role of government. And until that changes, we're going to be hard-pressed to win the kind of improvements that they're in the process of winning in Manitoba. So at the end of the day, we need to bring the stories out. We need to take advantage of legislative opportunities that present themselves. We need to compare ourselves to other jurisdictions. But at the end of the day, the challenge in many ways is a political one. And until we have more people in the legislature who have a different view of the role of government, we're going to continue to have problems. So the solutions lie in lobbying, yes, in telling our stories, yes, but at the end of the day, it's also a political problem. And so the solution needs to be political as well.